Farzan, it seems like a lot of the conflict between Iran and Israel at the moment comes down to the stocks of both missiles on one hand and then interceptors on the other. What do we know about the actual missile capacity the Iranians have, and then subsequent to that, the deterrent capacity the Israelis have to shoot down missiles and so forth? Because obviously they're expending a tremendous number of interceptors shooting down ballistic missiles at this time, some of which are operated by American troops as well, to the THAAD missile batteries. Uh, do we have a sense of when that equation may shift, such that these barrages cannot be intercepted? And there's something about the Iranian strategy which could be aimed at exhausting those batteries at the beginning.
Yeah, I think that certainly on the Iranian side, that certainly could be part of the strategy. Now, if they were able to do the kind of larger volume strikes, they would have a better chance of increasing the penetration rate and also, not giving as much of a chance for the Israelis to refill some of their stocks and kind of re-equip these systems before the next barrage comes in. In terms of specific numbers, I've heard figures in the low thousands, very very low thousands, in terms of what Iran has left since the beginning of this conflict. Again, very low thousands without going into the specific number. Um, eh, you know, Theoretically, that number would be sufficient to, at some point in the foreseeable future, next few weeks or months, depending on the launch rate that Iranians are able to achieve, to exhaust some of the missile stocks that the Israelis have. But whether that's how it'll actually play out in practice, and whether their actual thesis regarding Israeli society kind of crying uncle before they do, that remains to be seen.
And what about the launchers? Because you briefly mentioned the launchers, and I've seen the Israeli side talk about their success at hitting those.
Yeah.
Just as a layperson, you can imagine that every time ballistic missiles are fired, that gives intelligence to the other side of where they're coming from. How quickly are they able to move those such that they can protect them from being destroyed immediately? If Iran has no control over its own airspace and there are jets kind of circling and missiles are fired, and the Israelis can quickly identify where the missiles are being fired from, why wouldn't they just be able to kind of eliminate the launchers? And how hard is it to remanufacture launchers? Is this a complicated 6-month process, like for all of our weapons here in the United States, or is this something where you can fairly quickly put together a new launcher?
Yeah. So regarding being able to kind of find and hit the actual launchers once they've fired, my understanding regarding kind of Israel's air defense system is that there is some bandwidth or capacity issues that arise when they're trying to defend and attack at the same time.
Mm.
Right. So they're not necessarily going to have, at a time when the missiles are immediately launched, they'll still have some capacity to strike simultaneously, but that bandwidth, because of the reallocation of some of the resources, whether it's aircraft, whether it's kind of the focus of various sensors and systems of that nature, the capacity to track the actual launchers on the ground in Iran and then strike them simultaneously will be reduced compared to when you're not in a kind of a strike phase, right, for on the Iranian side. And then in terms of the launchers themselves, I think early in the campaign, we're still in the first week, right? The Israelis appear to have had excellent intelligence, and also ability to sabotage Iran's systems, right? And so they probably had a good knowledge of where a lot of these launchers would be, and took the early initiative to destroy kind of a sufficient number to then create bottlenecks in terms of Iran's ability to launch missiles, right? In terms of the ability to rebuild them, it's somewhere in there, deeply buried in my workshop notes and the kind of literature about how long theoretically it would take to manufacture one versus a certain number. My sense is that unless Iran is, somehow assisted from abroad with maybe a comparable system that could be quickly adapted, which I don't have any particular insight into, which type of Russian or Chinese, for example, launcher would be, and how long that process of adaptation to Iranian systems would take. Maybe there's an option there that I'm not seeing. But my sense is that, in again, this is just the first week of the campaign, the Israelis aren't only going after a nuclear facility, missile and drone launch facilities and actual launchers and senior Iranian military personnel. They're also going for key bottlenecks in Iran's military kind of manufacturing capacity. And so this is probably some, and sorry, a lot of these facilities, unlike, let's say, the actual missile bases or some of the nuclear facilities themselves, are not hardened and are not deeply buried. Right.
Right.
So yeah, I think in the short-term window where in the short-term window being the next couple of weeks or in the next month or two, I think it's going to be more difficult for Iran to replenish those. And I'll just say one last point, which I forgot to say when we were talking about the launchers. Hunting launchers is not necessarily an easy task. They're small objects kind of moving around a very large geography. The Iranians, regardless of being caught off guard, have thought about this and thought about scenarios in which they would have to conceal launchers, move them around to different locations, deal with a kind of a lack of air superiority on their own territory. And as we've seen with the case of someone like the Houthis, right, where it's maybe a comparably distant geography as far as Israel is concerned and difficult terrain. They've been able to maintain a sufficient number of their launchers to continue to make ad hoc launches. And we have experience about this going back to the time of the Gulf War. Launcher hunting, missile hunting, launcher hunting. It's not necessarily an easy job. It's easier today, perhaps, than it was in the past. But Iran will probably sustain some capacity to continue to launch these. But again, in my view, this will allow Iran to resist Israel in a sense and make at least a kind of a putative or a very minimal resistance. It won't be enough to deter Israel, let alone the United States.
Farzan, I want to ask you something about you mentioned earlier too about Iran's options now in terms of how they may respond politically and how this may play out over weeks or months of how this conflict may continue. So it seems that the Trump administration has wanted Iran, their version of a nuclear deal is essentially a capitulation on the nuclear program and some kind of Libya-style dismantlement of enrichment capacity and maybe even beyond that as well too. Uh, can you explain from the Iranian perspective why they'd be averse to this outcome specifically? Because I see it, and I think we've others have commented as well too. It could be very dangerous actually to agree to a capitulation in some cases that foregoes this capacity or a critical capacity for a state indefinitely. What would it mean for the Iranians to quote unquote make a deal now, and why would that maybe lead them to resist that as long as possible?
Yeah. Well, trying to put myself in their shoes, right? I have some kind of sense of how they're thinking, but at the end of the day, this topmost decision makers may think quite differently from the types of people I might have contact with or read online or follow online. My sense is again that regardless of whether they want or would be ready to make a very conciliatory deal with major concessions, how do you trust Trump, right? Who, depending on which narrative you believe about how early he knew about Israel's plan to strike and to what extent and from how far back he was playing along with the Rus, right, to give Iran the impression that talks were happening and that a strike on its nuclear facilities was unlikely. Why would they then, turn around almost immediately and trust Trump to sign a deal and trust that even if they're able to sign a deal with Trump, that the Israelis won't continue strikes. They have this policy, for example, in Syria called the campaign between wars, and in Gaza they use this term of mowing the lawn, right? So yeah, maybe Israel says, well, we're not going after nuclear targets, but we're going to, now that the air is open, the skies are open. In Persian, we say, or the expression has become, oh, Iran's skies are becoming or have become an autobahn, right? Like a highway where anyone can kind of gonna come and go. That's the expression being used in some of the popular and elite discourse. So then, even if Trump makes a deal, and let's say that's a nuclear deal, what guarantee do they have that the Israelis won't continue strikes within Iran on Iranian targets? The other piece of it is that, well, if they're ready to capitulate after this demonstration of strength and have no resolve to continue to fight, then I think that that opens them to the perceptions that they're weak and that other actors will then come and try to kind of muscle Iran at a moment that it's down, knowing that, oh, they're weak, they could very well concede to us to try to gain concessions. So the demonstration of weakness and lack of results invites challenge, right? And so the other aspect of it is the domestic side. Let's say, and my macro thesis thinking about how Iran is approaching this is that We have this expression in Persian, which is in the English translation being drinking from the poison chalice. It's the expression that Khomeini, the Ayatollah Khomeini, used, the leader before the current leader, when accepting a ceasefire and end to the Iran-Iraq war. So they might be willing to drink from the poison chalice and make certain major concessions. The kind of caveats there are that, one, when Khomeini does this in 1988, that was after an 8-year exhaustive war, where they really understood that regardless of kind of the approach they took, the best they could probably achieve was a stalemate. But even in that context, Iran did not capitulate to Iraq, right? The drinking from the chalice poison was accepting the end to the war, right? So it wasn't like, oh, we fought for 8 years, we drank from the poison chalice, and we completely capitulated. No, they made a compromise. They agreed to end the war without achieving regime change against Saddam Hussein, who had invaded Iran in 1980. But at the end of the day, it wasn't some form of massive capitulation. The other piece of it is, if they did want to capitulate, it would also invite potentially enormous domestic challenge, because they would also look weak to their domestic audiences, right? And it would be and once that happens, they open a door to all other forms of internal challenge. And a huge piece of this is from what we might kind of label as the hardline social base of the system in Iran, right? I think a lot of the hesitancy to make concessions on the part of the leader as well as the system is because of the kind of viewpoints of this particular group. This is, as the Islamic Republic since the revolution has gradually become less popular, and especially under Khamenei, the hardcore social base of the system has shrunk to this particular group. It's very dangerous to kind of antagonize or disappoint this group at a time when the leader is quite elderly and Iran is considering making a transition. I heard about a recent kind of major discussion by foreign policy elites inside of Iran, where it seemed like across the political spectrum, except for the most hardline elements, a lot of people, including some connected to the Revolutionary Guards, felt that the acts of resistance needs to go. Right? It's no longer this conflict in the form that exists now, and the military support for the Axis, it's no longer sustainable. But why wouldn't they do it? Well, one of the people at this particular event said that, well, whoever is the one to do this could face the fate of Yitzhak Rabin. That's the specific phrasing they use. So it's very dangerous for the system to make sudden, massive concessions, opening themselves up to massive domestic challenge. And if they wanted to do that, they would have to do that over a period where they change the minds of this particular group, both at an elite and popular level.
I mean, ironically, and tell me if you think this is right, the way to do that would have been to, for the way that the U.S. could have eased them in that direction would have been to stay in the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. That probably gradually, 10 years later, you're getting to a place where maybe this like hardened system of axis of resistance isn't as necessary to keep locked in place, because there's more going on, and maybe you have a broader social base at that point. I guess it's kind of doesn't matter at this point because it's didn't happen. But was that a road that wasn't taken, you think, that would have led to what you're talking about?
Absolutely. And I wouldn't start in 2015. The group that is the progenitor of this particular the specific faction in parliament that's used to refer to this group is Jebhe Paidari, which means the Perseverance Front. That's one translation of it. So the kind of origins of this group goes to kind of the late 1990s, early 2000s as a political current. There are key pivot points, both for this particular group and faction and for the leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei himself, where they're willing to test engagement with the U.S. They're willing to test limited openings in relations, cooperation, and expounding the boundaries of that. And not to put this all on the U.S., because Iran bears an enormous amount of responsibility, and going back to 1979 for how this whole process played out. So, but just putting that element aside for a moment, there are many important pivot points. Starting with the kind of approach of the Clinton administration to the Khatami government in the late 1990s, the kind of post-Afghanistan 9/11 war on terror policies, and moving forward, where things that could have potentially blossomed into greater engagement that would have made somebody like the leader Khamenei in Iran less paranoid, and this group potentially either less relevant or less attractive for a certain subset of people. Those were a lot of missed opportunities. And the 2015 JCPOA was kind of one data point along this longer series, but of course a much more important one, because in 2015 they were able to put aside the distrust of the kind of post-Cold War and especially war on terror period and kind of reach a major deal. And around that time, both the Iranian president and leaders said, comments along the lines of, and with some small differences here, that, let's see how this goes, and if it goes well, maybe we can have a JCPOA 2 on this issue, and JCPOA 3 on that issue, and maybe more things will be possible. But let's see how this experience goes. And again, not to take away from any of the responsibility of the Islamic Republic for the state of affairs, but that's certainly a reality of how we got here.